You know, I've sat across from thousands of people over the decades, and if there is one thing I have learned, it is that money doesn't change who you are. It simply unmasks who you've been all along. We like to think of our bank accounts as a reflection of our hard work or our luck, but the truth is, your relationship with money is usually a mirror of your relationship with yourself. It's about your ego, your fears, and your need for control. When I first met Garrett, he didn't see it that way. He walked into my studio with a briefcase full of spreadsheets, a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas, and a heart so full of resentment that I could practically feel the heat coming off him from across the room. He wasn't there to find a solution. He was there to find an audience for his grievances. He wanted me to tell the world that he was a victim of circumstance. A brilliant man brought low by a series of unfortunate events and the betrayals of the people he trusted most. But as I've said a million times, you cannot change what you do not acknowledge. Garrett was standing in the middle of a burning house holding a gasoline can and screaming at the rain for not falling fast enough to save him. Garrett was a man in his late 40s, well-dressed, but with a certain frantic energy behind his eyes that told me he hadn't slept soundly in years. He had been a high flyer, a guy who made six figures in real estate and lived the kind of life most people only see on television. He had the house, the cars, the country club membership, and a wife, Elena, who had supported him through every venture. But when I looked at the files before we went on air, I didn't see a successful businessman who had hit a rough patch. I saw a man who had been playing a high-stakes game of poker with money that wasn't his, driven by a desperate need to be seen as the smartest guy in the room. He had lost it all, over $4 million, and now he was living in a rented apartment, facing foreclosure on his remaining assets, and his marriage was hanging by a thread. The labels he wore were entrepreneur, visionary, and provider. But the reality was much darker. He was a gambler who didn't know when to walk away. And worse, he was a blame shifter who refused to own a single second of his own failure. When we sat down for our pre-interview, the first thing he did was start laying out his defense. He didn't ask how Elena was doing in the other room, and he didn't express any remorse for the fact that their children's college funds were gone. Instead, he started talking about the 2008 crash, then the pandemic, then a business partner who he claimed had embezzled funds, and finally, he started in on Elena. He told me she was unsupportive, that her constant nagging had clouded his judgment and made it impossible for him to focus on the big picture. It was a classic case of externalizing. If he could make the problem about everything and everyone else, then he didn't have to look in the mirror and face the fact that he had made a series of arrogant, reckless choices. He was addicted to the big win, the kind of guy who would bet the grocery money on a long shot because he was convinced he had an inside track. I've seen this pattern so many times. It's a form of narcissism that uses financial success as a shield against inadequacy. If he had money, he was a god. Without it, he was nothing. And he would do anything to avoid feeling like nothing. I watched him as he talked, observing the way he adjusted his expensive watch, a relic of his former life that he refused to sell even when they couldn't afford health insurance. He was performing, he was trying to sell me on his version of the story, thinking that if he could get Dr. Phil on his side, he could go back home and use my name as a weapon against his creditors and his wife. He kept saying, "Doctor, Phil, you're a businessman. You understand how these things go. You have to take risk to win big." I just looked at him and let the silence hang for a moment. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own words. Taking a risk is one thing. Taking your family's security and setting it on fire because you have an ego that needs feeding is something else entirely. I could see the cracks in his armor, the slight tremor in his hands when he reached for his water glass. He was terrified. But his terror didn't manifest as humility, it manifested as rage. The backstory of how Garrett reached this point was a long, slow slide into delusion. He hadn't started out as a failure. In fact, he'd been quite successful early on. He had a natural talent for sales and an eye for property. But success is a dangerous drug for a man who hasn't dealt with his inner demons. As he started making money, he started believing his own press. He stopped listening to advisors, stopped looking at the fine print, and started believing that he was untouchable. He began moving money from one project to cover the losses of another, a classic Peter to pay Paul scenario that always, inevitably, ends in disaster. He hid the truth from Elena for years. He would come home, take her to expensive dinners, buy her jewelry, and tell her everything was perfect, all while the foundation of their life was rotting away. When the truth finally came out, when the bank started calling and the luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night, he didn't apologize. He didn't break down and ask for help. He got angry. He told her she didn't understand high finance. He told her she was being small-minded. As I delved deeper into his history during our private sessions, I began to see the why behind the behavior. Garrett had grown up in a house where his father was a laborer, a man who worked with his hands and struggled to make ends meet. Garrett had equated poverty with shame and wealth with worth. He had spent his entire adult life trying to run away from that little boy who felt ashamed of his father's old truck and the cramped house they lived in. To Garrett, admitting a financial mistake wasn't just about money, it was an admission that he was still that shameful little boy. He was overcompensating for a childhood wound that he had never allowed to heal. This is what I mean when I talk about the psychology of money. It's rarely about the math. If it were about the math, Garrett would have stopped 5 years ago. It's about the payoff, not the financial one, but the emotional one. He needed to feel powerful. He needed to feel like he was winning, even when he was losing everything that actually mattered. The escalation of his situation was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. After the initial crash, instead of taking a job and rebuilding slowly, Garrett doubled down. He took out high-interest loans. He borrowed money from his elderly parents under the guise of an investment opportunity, and he even tried to convince Elena to sign over her small inheritance from her grandmother. When she finally said no, when she finally set a boundary, that's when the real war started. He began a campaign of gaslighting, telling her she was the reason he couldn't recover. He told her that her lack of faith in him was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The tension in their home became unbearable. Their teenage children were caught in the crossfire, watching their father spiral into a manic obsession with the next big deal while their mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Garrett wasn't just losing money, he was losing his soul. He was becoming a stranger to the people who loved him most, and he was doing it all in the name of providing for them. It was a lie he told himself so often that he had started to believe it was the gospel truth. When we finally walked out onto that stage, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elena was already seated, looking small and exhausted in the oversized chair. She had the look of a woman who had spent the last 5 years holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, only to find out there was an entire warehouse of shoes coming down on her head. Garrett walked out, buttoned his suit jacket, and took his seat with a practiced air of confidence that I knew was as thin as a sheet of ice in April. He didn't look at her. He looked at the audience, he looked at the cameras, and he looked at me, looking for a cue on how to play his role. I've seen this 1,000 times. The performative husband who wants to appear reasonable while his partner is drowning in the reality he created. I started the conversation by asking Elena a simple question. When did you realize the life you thought you had was a fiction? She didn't hesitate. She told me about the Tuesday afternoon when she went to buy groceries and her card was declined. Then her secondary card. Then the emergency card. She described the humiliation of standing in line with a cart full of food for her children, having to walk away empty-handed while the cashier looked at her with pity. When she got home and confronted Garrett, he didn't apologize. He didn't tell her they were in trouble. He screamed at her for not using the right account and then spent 3 hours on the phone with the bank, loud enough for her to hear, berating a low-level employee for a clerical error that didn't exist. He was gaslighting her in real time to protect his own fragile sense of self-importance. Garrett interrupted her almost immediately. That's a mischaracterization, Elena. I told you there was a liquidity issue because the closing on the Sterling project got pushed back. You're making it sound like I was hiding things, but I was protecting you from the stress of the day-to-day fluctuations of the market. I turned to him and I didn't hold back. I asked him, protecting her or protecting your ego? Because if you're protecting someone, you don't let them walk into a grocery store with no money in their pocket. That's not protection. That's abandonment. You abandon your role as a partner because you were too proud to admit you were failing. He started to give me a lecture on market volatility, and I just put my hand up. I told him, Garrett, don't talk to me like I'm a freshman in an economics class. I know the difference between a bad market and a bad man. You have been lying to this woman for a decade, and you're still doing it right now under these lights. That was the first crack in the dam. He slumped back in his chair, his face turning a shade of mottled red. I began to peel back the layers of his investments. It turned out that the Sterling project he kept mentioning was nothing more than a pipe dream, a piece of undeveloped land he'd bought with borrowed money that had no permits, no utility access, and no hope of being built. But he had spent years talking about it as if it were the crown jewel of his empire. He had lived in a fantasy world, and he had forced his family to live there with him. I pointed out that he wasn't just losing money, he was stealing time. He was stealing years of peace from his wife and years of security from his children. The confrontation deepened when I brought out the documents Elena had sent my producers. It wasn't just business debt. It was a trail of secret credit cards, a second mortgage he'd forged her signature on, and a series of loans from friends that he had no intention of paying back. I looked him in the eye and said, "You've been living a double life, Garrett. You're a financial predator, and your primary prey has been the woman sitting next to you." He tried to argue that he was investing in their future, but I shut that down fast. I told him, you don't invest in a future by destroying the present. You were chasing a high. You were gambling with their lives because you didn't have the courage to be an ordinary man with an ordinary job. Elena started to cry then, not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet, shoulder-shaking kind that comes from a person who has finally been heard. She said she felt like she'd been living in a house of mirrors, never knowing what was real and what was a lie. Garrett's reaction was fascinating from a psychological standpoint. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't reach out a hand. He sat there looking annoyed, as if her pain was an inconvenience to his defense strategy. This is what we call narcissistic injury. When the facade is breached, the narcissist doesn't feel guilt. They feel rage because their audience is no longer buying the performance. I asked him, what is the payoff for you? What do you get out of keeping this charade going even now when you're broke and your wife is talking about divorce? He didn't have an answer at first. He just stared at the floor. I pushed him. Is it because as long as you're the guy who lost a fortune, you're still a guy who had a fortune? Because if you admit you're just a guy who made bad choices and needs to go get a job at a hardware store to pay the rent, then you're just like everyone else? Is that what scares you? Being average? You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. For the first time, the visionary had nothing to say. The truth was that Garrett didn't value money for what it could buy. He valued it for the distance it put between him and the rest of humanity. Without it, he felt naked. We went to a break, and during the downtime, I watched them on the monitors. He was leaning over, whispering urgently to her, not apologizing, but clearly trying to manage her, trying to tell her what to say when we came back. He was still trying to control the narrative. I walked back out and decided to shift gears. I wanted to talk about the internalized script he was following. I explained to him that he was repeating the cycle of his childhood, but in reverse. His father had been an honest man who struggled. Garrett wanted to be a dishonest man who flourished. He had equated honest struggle with failure and dishonest success with winning. I told him, "Your father might have been poor, but I bet people could take his word to the bank. Nobody can take your word anywhere but to the lawyer's office." That hit him hard. For a moment, the bravado vanished, and I saw the scared little boy he had been hiding. He admitted that he had always felt like a fraud, even when he had the $4 million. He felt that if he stopped for 1 second, if he stopped the hustle, everyone would see that he was nothing. I told him, "Garrett, you've spent 40 years trying to be something, and in the process, you've become a nothing to your kids and a nobody to your wife. You have traded the substance of your life for the shadow of a reputation." We spent the next hour dissecting the mechanics of his lies, the way he used complexity to shut down Elena's questions, the way he used his anger as a shield to keep anyone from getting too close to the truth. It was a masterclass in how a person can use their intellect to sabotage their own life. The look on Garrett's face when I brought up his father was something I won't soon forget. It was like I'd reached into his chest and grabbed hold of a secret he hadn't even admitted to himself. He'd spent his whole life trying to outrun the ghost of a man who worked hard but never made it in the way the world measures success. Garrett had decided at a very young age that he would never be that guy. He would never have dirt under his fingernails or a mortgage he couldn't pay. The irony, of course, was that by trying so hard to avoid his father's failure, he had created a catastrophe that was 10 times worse. His father may have been poor, but he had dignity. Garrett was broke, and he had traded his dignity for a front row seat to his own destruction. I leaned in closer to him, lowering my voice, but keeping the pressure on. "Garrett," I said, "you're so busy trying to be a titan of industry that you've forgotten how to be a man." A man doesn't forge his wife's signature. A man doesn't take his parents' retirement money and put it on a red-black spin in the real estate market. That's not business. That's a betrayal of the highest order. He tried to stammer out a defense, talking about repayment schedules and projected returns, but I wasn't having it. I told him straight, "Stop the technobabble. You stole from the people who loved you because you thought you were too smart to get caught and too big to fail." How's that working for you right now? Look at Elena. Look at her. He finally turned his head to look at his wife, and for the first time in the hour we'd been talking, his expression softened not into guilt, but into a sort of pathetic confusion. He genuinely didn't understand why she wasn't on his side. In his mind, he was the hero of a tragedy, and she was supposed to be the loyal queen standing by him while he fought the dragons of the market. He didn't see that he was the dragon. I asked Elena to tell him what life was like at home when the cameras weren't rolling. She described a house filled with vibration. That's the word she used. She said the air in their home felt like it was constantly humming with Garrett's anxiety and rage. He would pace the floors until 3 a.m, muttering about interest rates and betrayals by people she'd never met. If she asked a question, any question, even something as simple as, "Do we have enough for the electric bill?" he would explode. He would tell her she didn't have vision, that she was dragging him down with her small-mindedness. He'd made her feel like she was the crazy one for wanting to know if they were going to be homeless next month. This is the hallmark of a high-functioning narcissist in a tailspin. They create a reality and then punish anyone who dares to point out that the emperor has no clothes. I turned back to Garrett. "You've been emotionally abusing this woman to cover up your financial incompetence," I said. You used your anger to silence her because you knew if she looked too closely at the books, she'd see exactly what I'm seeing, a man who is way out of his depth and playing a game he doesn't understand. Garrett bristled at the word incompetence. That was the one word he couldn't stomach. He could be called a liar, a thief, or a bad husband, but don't call him a bad businessman. He started listing his past successes again, the deals he'd closed in the early 2000s, the millions he'd moved. I stopped him. Garrett, nobody cares what you did 20 years ago. We're talking about today. Today, you are a man who can't buy a gallon of milk without a credit card that's over its limit. Your past success is just a weapon you're using to justify your current failure. We moved on to the impact on the children. This is where the story got truly heartbreaking. Their daughter, a straight-A student, had been accepted into a prestigious university. Garrett had told her for years that her education was handled, that he had a trust fund set up for her. When the time came to pay the tuition, the trust fund was empty. He drained it 3 years prior to cover a margin call on a bad stock tip. He didn't tell his daughter. He let her get all the way to move-in day before the school informed her that her bill hadn't been paid. She had to move back home, humiliated, and enroll in the local community college. Even then, Garrett didn't admit he'd spent the money. He told her there was an administrative snafu with the bank and that he'd have it sorted out by the next semester. He lied to his own child's face, watching her dreams crumble, just so he wouldn't have to admit he'd failed. I asked him, "How do you sleep at night knowing you looked your daughter in the eye and lied to her about her future?" He looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. "I was going to replace it," he whispered. "I had a deal closing in October. I would have put back double what I took." I shook my head. "That's the gambler's mantra, Garrett. One more win and I'll make it right." "But you didn't have a deal closing. You had a fantasy. You traded your daughter's future for a chance to keep your ego inflated for another 6 months." I wanted to get to the core of his payoff. Every behavior has a payoff, or you wouldn't do it. For Garrett, the payoff wasn't the money. He'd proven he didn't know how to keep it. The payoff was the image of being a man of power. I told him, "You'd rather be a broke big shot than a stable average guy. You look down on the man who goes to work at 9 and comes home at 5 with a steady paycheck. You think he's a loser, but that loser has a wife who trusts him and kids who are actually going to college. You have a mountain of debt and a family that's terrified of you." I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was looking for a way to pivot, a way to make this my fault or the show's fault. He started complaining about the tone of the interview, saying he didn't come here to be attacked. I told him, "You didn't come here to be attacked. You came here to be validated. You thought I was going to tell Elena she needed to be more supportive of your genius. Well, the genius store is closed, Garrett. We're dealing with the reality store now." I shifted the focus to the forgery. I asked him how he justified signing Elena's name to a legal document that put their home at risk. He tried to claim it was a power of attorney issue, that he thought he had the right. I pulled out the document and showed it to the audience. It wasn't a power of attorney. It was a blatant, shaky-handed forgery. "You were desperate," I said. "And a desperate man is a dangerous man. You were so afraid of losing the house, not because you wanted a roof over your family's head, but because losing the house meant the neighbors would know you were broke. You risked your wife's legal standing to save your social standing." Elena was watching him, and I could see the light bulb finally going on for her. She wasn't seeing the successful husband who had hit a run of bad luck anymore. She was seeing the man I was describing, a man who had prioritized his own vanity over her safety. She turned to him and asked, "Garrett, do you even love us, or are we just props in your movie?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because if he admitted he loved them, he'd have to admit how badly he'd hurt them. And if he admitted he'd hurt them, the great man persona would shatter completely. I told him that the first step toward any kind of recovery, financial or emotional, was a total lifestyle collapse. I told him he needed to sell the watch, sell the remaining car, move into a small apartment, and get a job, any job that paid a regular wage. You need to learn the value of $1 that you actually earned, I said, instead of the value of $1 million you borrowed. The look of disgust on his face when I suggested he get a regular job was telling. He truly believed he was above that kind of work. I told him, Garrett, right now you aren't above anything. You are at the bottom of a hole and you're still digging. The only way out is to drop the shovel. The silence that followed my suggestion for him to get a regular job was heavy, suffocating even. Garrett looked at me as if I'd asked him to go out and sweep the streets with a toothbrush. This is the fundamental disconnect with a man like him. He had spent so long building a house of cards that he actually believed he lived in a stone fortress. To him, an honest day's work for an honest day's pay wasn't a path to redemption. It was a demotion from a rank he felt he'd earned by right of his intellect. I leaned back, crossed my legs, and just watched him. I wanted the audience to see that look of disdain. It told the story better than any spreadsheet ever could. It was the look of a man who would rather starve in a suit than thrive in a uniform. I decided it was time to bring in the collateral damage that usually stays hidden in these cases: his parents. I had my team do some digging before the show, and what we found was devastating. Garrett's parents, both in their late 70s, had worked hard their entire lives. His father was the laborer he was so ashamed of, and his mother had been a school teacher. They had a modest nest egg, enough to ensure they wouldn't be a burden on their children in their final years. 2 years ago, Garrett had sat them down and told them he had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He told them he wanted to give back to them to turn their modest savings into a fortune that would allow them to travel the world. He played on their pride in him. They saw their successful son, the one who lived in the big house and drove the German cars, and they trusted him. They handed over nearly $300,000, their entire life savings. I looked at Garrett and I didn't mince words. Your parents are currently living on Social Security alone, aren't they? He wouldn't look at me. They're fine, Dr. Phil. It's a long-term play. They'll get it back with interest. I slammed my hand on the arm of my chair. With what interest, Garrett? You spent that money in 60 days to pay off a high-interest bridge loan that was about to default. You didn't invest it. You used your elderly parents as a human shield to keep the creditors away from your front door for another 2 months. That money is gone. It's not in a long-term play. It's in the pocket of a lender in Jersey who doesn't even know your parents' names. Elena gasped. She hadn't known the full extent of the betrayal of his parents. She knew he'd helped them with their finances, but she didn't know he'd liquidated their retirement. The look she gave him in that moment was different from the others. It wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated horror. She was realizing that there were no boundaries for this man. If he would rob the people who gave him life, what wouldn't he do to her? I told Garrett, you talk about being a provider, but you are a parasite. You've been feeding off the people who love you because you're too cowardly to face the consequences of your own mistakes. He tried to stand up then, the classic exit, stage right move when the heat gets too high. I told him to sit back down. You've spent your whole life running, Garrett. For once, sit still and feel the weight of what you've done. You owe it to your wife, you owe it to your kids, and you damn sure owe it to your parents to stay in that chair and hear the truth. He sat, but he was vibrating with that same nervous energy Elena had described. He was looking for an out, a way to twist the narrative. He started talking about how unfair it was to bring his parents into this, that it was a private family matter. I told him, there are no private matters when you're committing financial elder abuse. You brought them into it when you took their checkbook. The confrontation then shifted to the why. I wanted to understand, and I wanted him to understand what the payoff was for this level of destruction. I asked him, when you're lying in bed at night and you know the bank is coming and you know your parents are broke because of you and you know your wife is one phone call away from leaving, what is the thought that keeps you going? What is the lie you tell yourself so you can breathe? He was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he said, I just wanted to be someone. I didn't want to be like my father. I didn't want to be invisible. There it was, the central problem. He equated being average with being invisible. To Garrett, if he wasn't winning, he didn't exist. He had a hole in his soul that no amount of money could fill, and because he couldn't fill it, he tried to cover it up with the appearance of wealth. I told him, Garrett, your father wasn't invisible. He was a man people could count on. He was a man who stood for something. You, on the other hand, are a ghost. You're a collection of lies and expensive clothes, and there's nothing underneath. You've become the very thing you feared, a man with no legacy. I turned to Elena. You have a choice to make, I said. You can keep trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble, or you can get in the lifeboat and save yourself and your children. Because let me be clear, Garrett is not a distressed businessman. He is a man with a character flaw that is currently untreated. Until he owns every lie, every forgery, and every betrayal, he is not a safe person to be around. He will take you down with him, and he will tell you it's for your own good the whole way down. She looked at him, then back at me, and I saw a flicker of resolve that hadn't been there before. She asked him, Garrett, will you go to the bank with me tomorrow, sign over the remaining assets, and let me handle the bankruptcy? Will you let the big shot die so we can just be a family? Garrett's response was a perfect illustration of the struggle. He didn't say yes. He started talking about a restructuring plan he'd been working on. He couldn't let go. Even at the absolute bottom, with his world in ruins, he was still trying to deal his way out. He was like a gambler at the track who's lost his car, his house, and his wedding ring, but is convinced that if he can just get $5 for the next race, he'll win it all back. I told him, you're an addict, Garrett. You're not addicted to drugs or alcohol. You're addicted to the big win and the big image. And like any addict, you will destroy everyone in your path to get your next fix of validation. I spent the next part of the session breaking down the restitution phase. I told him that if he wanted any chance of a relationship with his children, he had to tell them the truth, all of it. No administrative snafus, no liquidity issues. He had to look his daughter in the eye and say, I spent your college money because I was arrogant and selfish. I told him he had to go to his parents and admit he'd gambled away their security. The thought of this seemed to physically pain him. He started crying real tears this time, I think, but I didn't back off. I've learned that tears are often just another way to avoid the work. Don't cry for yourself, Garrett, I said. Cry for the people you've hurt. Use that pain to fuel some actual change for once. We talked about the ego death he was going to have to go through. He was going to have to walk into a place of business, fill out an application, and be employee number 402. He was going to have to take orders from people he thought were below him. I told him that this wasn't a punishment. It was his only hope for a soul. If he could learn to be an average man who was honest, he would be 10 times the man he was when he had $4 million in the bank. I could see him struggling with it, the titan in his head screaming against the reality of the situation. I asked Elena what she needed from him right now, in this moment. She said, I don't need money. I don't need a big house. I just need to know that when he tells me the sun is out, I don't have to go outside and check for myself. I need the truth to be the foundation of our life, or I need to be gone. I looked at Garrett. Can you do that? Can you commit to a life where you are never the smartest guy in the room again? Can you commit to being an honest man who is broke rather than a successful man who is a fraud? He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the audience, then at the floor. The silence stretched on, and in that silence, you could see the entire trajectory of his future hanging in the balance. Garrett's response, when it finally came, wasn't a grand proclamation of change. It was a whisper. "I'll try," he said. I stopped him right there. "No," I said, "we don't try to stop lying to our wives. We don't try to stop stealing from our parents. You either do it or you admit you have no intention of changing and you let these people go so they can have a life. Trying is just a back door you're leaving open so you can slip out when the work gets too hard." He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the visionary or the businessman. I saw a man who was exhausted by his own pretenses. He finally nodded, a short, sharp movement. "I will do it," he said. And in that moment, the vibration Elena had described seemed to settle just a little bit. We provided them with the resources they needed, intensive individual therapy for Garrett to deal with his deep-seated issues of inadequacy and his invisible man complex, and joint counseling for them to see if the wreckage of their marriage could ever be cleared away. I made it clear to Garrett that my help was contingent on one thing: total, radical transparency. He had to hand over the keys to his digital life, his bank accounts, and his remaining business files to a third-party fiduciary we appointed. He had to become a passenger in his own financial life because he had proven he couldn't be trusted behind the wheel. It was a bitter pill for a man who defined himself by control, but he swallowed it. He had no other choice. In the months that followed the show, the outcome wasn't a Hollywood ending. Real change is a slow, ugly, painful process. Garrett didn't wake up the next morning and become a different human being. He struggled. He had withdrawals from the high of the deal. About 6 weeks after they returned home, he tried to open a secret line of credit to flip a small piece of equipment he'd found online. He thought he could make a quick $2,000 and put it back before anyone noticed. But the fiduciary caught it. Instead of covering for him, Elena followed through on the plan we'd established. She moved out that same day. She took the kids and went to her sister's house, and she didn't take his calls for a month. That was Garrett's true bottom. Not the $4 million loss, not the show, but the silence of an empty house and the realization that his smart moves had finally left him completely alone. He spent that month in intensive therapy, finally digging into the shame he felt about his father's average life. He started to realize that his father hadn't been invisible because he was poor. His father had been visible to everyone who mattered because he was reliable. Garrett had been the one who was invisible because no one knew who he actually was. They only knew the character he was playing. When they eventually reconciled, it was on entirely different terms. Garrett took a job at a local supply company. He wasn't the CEO. He was a guy in the middle of the pack earning a steady, modest salary. He told me later that the first time he handed Elena his actual paycheck, the whole thing, with no side hustles or hidden accounts, it was the most terrifying and liberating moment of his life. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a man with a job and a family. He sold the luxury watch and used the money to start a small monthly repayment plan to his parents. It will take him decades to pay them back, and he knows he might never finish the job before they pass away, but he's doing it. He's owning the debt instead of running from it. Elena is still with him, but she isn't the same woman she was. She doesn't ask for permission anymore, and she doesn't accept complexity as an answer. She manages the family's finances with an iron fist, and Garrett has accepted that this is the price of his seat at the table. Their daughter is back in school, working 20 hours a week to help pay her own way, and Garrett is right there beside her, helping her with her homework and being the father he'd only ever pretended to be before. The house of cards is gone, and in its place is a small, sturdy foundation built on the truth. As I look back on Garrett's story, it's a reminder that the biggest lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. We use money, status, and power to build a fortress around our insecurities, but all we're doing is building our own prison. Garrett had to lose his fortune to find his soul. He had to become average to become a man of substance. He still has days where the ego flares up, where he wants to chase the big win and prove to the world that he's something special. But then he looks at his wife's face and his children's eyes, and he remembers that being someone isn't about the balance in your bank account. It's about the integrity in your heart. He's not a rich man by the world's standards, but for the first time in his life, he isn't a fraud. He's standing on solid ground, and he's finally truly visible.